The gate at the edge of the north field was locked, and Eleanor Ashworth had not locked it. She stood in the cold morning air, with her hand still on the iron bar, staring at a chain that had never been there before. Behind her, the grass sloped down toward the river that marked the boundary of her family's land. Beyond the gate, a man on horseback watched her with an expression she could not read. "You have no right to close this field," she said. The man dismounted slowly. He was tall, dressed in a dark coat that fit him too well for a stranger passing through, and his eyes moved over her the way a man studies something he has been told about but never seen. "I have every right," he said. "This land belongs to the Harcourt estate. This land has belonged to my family for 40 years. Then your family has been farming land it does not own." He said it without cruelty, almost gently, which made it worse. "I am Julian Harcourt. I believe you know my name." She did know it. Everyone in the county knew it. The old duke had died in the spring, and his son had inherited the title along with debts, disputes, and a dozen boundary lines that had never been properly settled. She had hoped, foolishly, that the new duke would be too occupied with London to notice one small field on the edge of his land. "My father has documents," she said. "Deeds, records going back to my grandfather." "So do I." Julian's voice was even, but something flickered behind his eyes, something that did not match the flatness of his words. "And mine go back further." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. This field was not the largest part of her father's estate, but it was the richest soil they had, the one that had kept them from ruin these last 3 winters. Without it, she did not know how they would manage the spring planting, let alone pay what they owed. "Then let us see them," she said. "Bring your documents to my father's house, and we will bring ours, and we will settle this like reasonable people, instead of you locking gates before the sun is fully up." Something almost like amusement crossed his face. "You are not what I expected." "And what did you expect?" "I am not certain. Something quieter, perhaps." He studied her again, that same unsettling attention, as though he were searching her face for a feature he already knew. "You have your mother's eyes." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Eleanor went very still. "You did not know my mother," she said. "No," Julian said, "I did not." But he had said it too quickly, and the way he looked away from her told her the sentence was not finished, that there was more behind it. He had decided, in that instant, not to say. Eleanor had spent her whole life reading the small movements of people who did not want to be read, watching her father's face for signs of debt collectors, watching neighbors for signs of pity. She knew when someone was hiding something. "You said I have her eyes," Eleanor pressed. "How would you know that, if you never knew her?" "A portrait, perhaps. My father kept many things from the neighboring families." He turned back to his horse, ending the conversation with the ease of a man accustomed to ending conversations whenever he pleased. "Bring your documents this afternoon. I will have mine ready." "And the chain on the gate?" "Stays until we have settled the matter." He swung up into the saddle. "I would not want anyone taking what may not be theirs to take." He rode off before she could answer, leaving her standing at the locked gate with the wind pulling at her skirt and a strange, cold feeling settling into her stomach that had nothing to do with the loss of the field. By the time she returned to the house, her father was already awake, standing at the window of his study with a cup of tea going cold in his hand. Sir Edmund Ashworth had once been a robust man, the kind who rode out at dawn and worked beside his tenants in the fields, but the last 3 years had worn him thin. His hair had gone gray faster than it should have, and his hands, when they were not occupied with papers, trembled slightly in a way he tried to hide. "He has locked the north gate," Eleanor said, before her father could ask. Edmund's cup rattled against its saucer. "On what grounds?" "He says the land belongs to Harcourt. He says he has documents older than ours." "Impossible. Your grandfather purchased that field outright. I have the deed in the strongbox." "Then bring it, father, because he wants to meet this afternoon and compare records like a man settling a business matter over tea." Edmund set down his cup and moved to the old iron strongbox kept beneath the floor of his study, the one Eleanor had seen opened only a handful of times in her life. He knelt before it, hands shaking now not with age but with something closer to fear, and drew out a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon. Eleanor watched him sort through them, watched his frown deepen. "It is here," he muttered. "It must be here." "Father?" "The deed. I know it is here." He pulled sheet after sheet free, scattering them across the desk, his breathing growing shorter. "Your mother kept these organized. Since she passed, I confess I have not looked at them as carefully as I should." At the mention of her mother, Eleanor's mind returned, unbidden, to the strange moment at the gate. "You have your mother's eyes. A portrait, perhaps." She had not believed him even as he said it, and she believed him even less now. "Father," she said slowly, "did Mother ever speak of the old Duke?" Edmund's hands stilled over the papers. It was brief, no longer than a breath, but Eleanor caught it, the same flicker of hidden knowledge she had seen in Julian's face at the gate. "Why would you ask such a thing?" "Because the new Duke looked at me this morning as though he recognized me. He said I have her eyes." "He is a stranger playing games to unsettle you before a negotiation," Edmund said too quickly, gathering the papers back into an untidy stack. "Do not give it another thought. We will find the deed, and we will end this before it becomes anything more than a boundary dispute." But Eleanor did give it another thought, all through the long morning as her father searched every drawer and box in the house without success, and all through the walk to the ducal manor that afternoon, and all through the hour they sat in Julian Harcourt's study while he laid out papers that were, infuriatingly, exactly as old and exactly as convincing as he had promised. The two sets of documents did not agree. Her father's deed, when at last a copy was found among her mother's old correspondence rather than the strongbox, named the field as Ashworth property, purchased in a sale nearly 40 years past. Julian's papers, drawn from his father's private records, described the same field as land held in trust by the Harcourt estate, never sold, only lent. "Lent," Edmund repeated, his voice rising. "Land is not lent for 40 years without a single word spoken of it." "And yet here it is, in my father's own hand," Julian said, sliding the paper across the desk. "I did not ask for this dispute, Sir Edmund. I inherited it, the same as I inherited the title I did not want and the debts I did not create." Eleanor watched the two men argue in circles, watched her father grow paler with every exchange, and felt the cold feeling from the morning return and settle deeper. There was something beneath this argument, something neither man was saying, something that lived in the space between her father's evasive glance and Julian's talk of a portrait he should not have seen. When the meeting ended without resolution and her father stormed out ahead of her, still muttering about lawyers and courts, Julian caught Eleanor's arm gently at the door. "Miss Ashworth, Your Grace." "There is more to this than land," he said quietly, his voice low enough that her father, already halfway to the carriage, could not hear. "I cannot tell you all of it yet, but I give you my word, this is not only about a field. Then what is it about?" He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might actually answer her. Instead, he released her arm and stepped back, his expression closing like a door shutting against the cold. "Come to the manor again, alone, when you are ready to hear it," he said. "I do not think your father is prepared to." Eleanor rode home in silence, her father's frustration filling the carriage like smoke, and stared out at the darkening fields that might no longer belong to her family, wondering what promise, made by whom, to whom, had followed her all the way to a locked gate on a cold morning, and why the answer seemed to live behind her mother's closed eyes, rather than any deed written on paper. That night, once her father had retired with a glass of brandy and a heavier silence than usual, Eleanor climbed to the small attic room where her mother's belongings had been stored since her death 3 years earlier. The room smelled of dust and old cedar. A single trunk sat beneath the window, its lock long broken, and Eleanor knelt before it the way her father had knelt before the strongbox that morning, as though some truth might be waiting inside, if only she looked hard enough. She lifted out folded shawls, a set of gloves gone stiff with age, a small wooden box of buttons her mother had saved for mending. Nothing that answered any question. She was nearly ready to close the lid when her fingers brushed the trunk's false bottom, a thin panel she had never noticed before, warped just enough at one corner to lift with a fingernail. Beneath it lay a bundle of letters, tied with string, the paper yellowed and soft with age. Eleanor's hands trembled as she untied them. The handwriting was not her mother's familiar, careful script. It was bolder, slanted, a man's hand, and the letters were addressed simply to M, with no surname at all. She did not read them that night. She could not make herself do it, not yet, not with her father's door still open a crack down the hall and the candle burning low. Instead, she retied the string with careful fingers and pressed the bundle to her chest, feeling the weight of it as though it were heavier than paper had any right to be. Whatever her mother had kept hidden for so many years, it had followed her into the ground and left its shadow behind for her daughter to find. Eleanor thought of Julian Harcourt's face at the gate, the strange gentleness in his voice when he said she had her mother's eyes, and the closed, guarded look that had come over him at the manor when he told her there was more to this than land. She thought, too, of her father's trembling hands over the strongbox, the way his voice had risen too quickly when she asked about the old Duke, the evasive answer that had not really answered anything at all. Two men, father and Duke, both circling the same secret from opposite sides, and only she seemed willing to walk toward it directly. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, she dreamed of her mother standing at the edge of the north field, young and unfamiliar, speaking to a man whose face she could not see, the two of them framed by a gate that had not yet been chained shut, and a promise passing between them that the years had not been kind enough to keep. Eleanor read the first letter 3 days later, sitting alone in the attic, with the door bolted and the household certain she had gone walking in the orchard. The paper had softened with age, but the words were still sharp enough to cut. The man who had written them addressed her mother not as a neighbor or an acquaintance, but as someone he had wronged and hoped, desperately, to make right. He spoke of a promise made beside the river, of land that should have passed to her by rights, of a debt he intended to honor before the end of his life, whatever it cost him. He signed the letter only with the initial J. Eleanor sat with the paper in her lap for a long time, listening to her own heartbeat, before she understood what should have been obvious from the first line. J. Not Julian. The old Duke. Julian's father, writing to her mother in a hand that trembled with something between guilt and tenderness, promising a debt he apparently never lived to pay. She read the second letter, then the third, each one adding a fragment to a picture she did not yet fully understand. There was mention of a covenant, a written agreement kept somewhere safe, meant to secure the field for her mother's family regardless of what happened between the two estates. There was mention, too, of Lady Constance, the old Duke's sister, described in careful, guarded language as someone who must never learn of the arrangement. By the time Eleanor climbed down from the attic, the sun had nearly set, and she had made a decision she was not entirely comfortable with. She would go to Julian Harcourt, alone, as he had asked, and she would bring the letters with her. She told her father she was visiting a friend in the village. He did not question her, too absorbed in his own search through ledgers and correspondence for a deed that continued to elude him. Eleanor rode to the manor as the last light faded from the sky, and she was shown into Julian's study by a housekeeper who seemed to expect her, as though her visit had been anticipated. Julian rose when she entered, and something in his face shifted at the sight of the bundle in her hands. "You found them," he said. It was not a question. "You knew about the letters." "I suspected." He gestured for her to sit, though she remained standing. The letters clutched tightly enough that her knuckles had gone pale. "My father spoke of your mother before he died. Not often, and never fully, but enough that I understood there was a debt unpaid. He asked me, in his final months, to see it settled, though he would not tell me what settling it meant. Then tell me now what you know, all of it, and stop offering me pieces as though I am too fragile for the whole." Something in her voice must have convinced him, because he sat down heavily behind his desk and rubbed a hand across his face, looking older in that moment than his years should have allowed. "My father and your mother knew each other before either of them married," he said. "Before your father, before mine. There was an understanding between them once, a promise of marriage, that circumstance and family pressure did not allow to be kept. My father married for the estate. Your mother married your father, a man of good character but modest means. But my father never stopped believing he owed her something for the promise he broke." Eleanor's chest tightened. What did he owe her? The field. He intended to sign it over to her outright, free of any claim from the Harcourt estate, as a form of restitution. There was a covenant drawn up, witnessed, meant to be filed alongside the estate's other legal papers, but my father died before it could be properly registered, and in the chaos following his death, the document went missing. "Missing?" Eleanor repeated. "Or hidden?" Julian's silence was answer enough. "You believe your aunt has it," Eleanor said. "I believe my aunt would do a great many things to keep the Harcourt name free of scandal, and a secret promise made to a woman my father should never have loved the way he did would qualify, in her mind, as precisely such a scandal." Eleanor set the letters on the desk between them, no longer able to hold them without her hands shaking. "My mother never told me any of this. My father clearly knows something, or suspects it, but he has said nothing either. Perhaps he does not know the full truth. Perhaps your mother protected him from it, the same way she protected you." Julian's eyes met hers, and there was something raw in them now, something that had nothing to do with land or covenants. "I did not expect, when I locked that gate, that I would find myself sitting across from the daughter of a woman my father loved his entire life, and could never have. I did not expect to find that I understand, now, why he never stopped speaking of her. You are trying to distract me from the matter of the field. I am trying to tell you the truth, which is more than either of our fathers managed to do." He leaned forward. Eleanor, if the covenant exists, and if my aunt has hidden it, then the field was never truly in dispute at all. It has been yours, rightfully, since before you were born. The weight of it settled over her slowly, the way cold settles into a room after a fire burns low. Her mother, young and hopeful, promised to a man she could not marry. A field meant as an apology that never reached her hands. A daughter who grew up believing her family's survival depended on the mercy of strangers, when in truth it depended on a secret buried in a locked drawer somewhere in this very house. We need to find it, Eleanor said. The covenant. Before your aunt destroys it, if she has not already. She will not destroy it easily. My aunt believes in keeping leverage, not burning it. If she has the document, she has it somewhere close, somewhere she can produce or deny as it suits her purposes. Then we search. Julian studied her for a long moment, something like admiration breaking through the careful reserve he had worn since the moment they met at the gate. You are remarkably calm for someone who has just learned her entire family's fortune rests on a stolen piece of paper. I have spent 3 years watching my father lose everything a little at a time. I have stopped being frightened by the size of a problem and started asking only how to solve it. A faint, unexpected smile crossed his face. Your mother would be proud of that, I think. You did not know my mother. No, he said again, softer this time. But I begin to feel as though I do, through you. The words hung between them, warmer than either of them likely intended, and Eleanor looked away first, uncomfortable with how easily his voice had found its way past her guard. She gathered the letters back into their bundle and rose to leave, aware suddenly of how late the hour had grown and how her father would soon begin to wonder where she had gone. I will come again, she said, when I have found a way to search the house without your aunt noticing. Come whenever you wish. Julian walked her to the door, and for a moment his hand hovered near hers, not quite touching. And Eleanor, whatever we find, whatever the covenant says, I intend to see this made right, not because my father asked it of me, because it is the right thing to do, and because I find I do not wish to be the kind of man who locks gates against people who deserve better. She rode home through the dark with the letters pressed against her chest, and her thoughts full of a man she had met only 2 days before, who had somehow, in the space of a single conversation, become tangled inextricably with the fate of her family, the memory of her mother, and a hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. The following morning, Eleanor found her father in the study again, surrounded by the same scattered papers, his eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. She had not decided how much to tell him. The letters felt too fragile, too personal, to hand over without warning, and she feared what the truth might do to a man already worn thin by worry. You were out late, he said, not looking up from the ledger in front of him. I went to see the Duke again. That drew his attention. He set down his pen slowly, alone, without telling me. You have been searching for a deed that does not exist in the way you believe it does, Father. She chose her words carefully, watching his face for the flicker she had learned to recognize. I think Mother knew something about this dispute that she never told either of us. Edmund's hand tightened around the pen until his knuckles whitened. Your mother is not part of this. Isn't she? You flinched yesterday morning when I asked if she ever spoke of the old Duke. You have flinched every time his name has come up since. I am not a child, Father. I can see when you are hiding something. For a long moment she thought he would deny it again, retreat into the same evasive silence he had offered at the gate. Instead, something in him seemed to give way, the way old wood finally splits under enough pressure. Your mother knew the old Duke before I met her, he admitted quietly. She never told me the particulars, only that there had been an understanding between them once, long before either of us married. I did not press her for details. I loved her, and I trusted that whatever had passed between them belonged to a life she had chosen to leave behind. And you never wondered why the Harcourt estate has always left our boundary lines untouched, all these years, until now. Edmund's silence answered the question more clearly than words could have. I wondered, he admitted. I told myself it was courtesy between neighbors. I did not wish to examine it too closely, because examining it meant admitting that some part of your mother's heart had belonged to another man before it ever belonged to me. Eleanor sat down across from him, softened despite herself by the rare honesty in his voice. There was a promise, Father. A covenant, meant to give her the field outright, as an apology for a broken engagement neither of them chose. The old Duke meant to file it before he died, but it went missing. Julian believes his aunt may have hidden it. Her father's face went through several expressions in quick succession, disbelief giving way to something closer to grief. All these years we might have owned that field free and clear, and instead I have spent 3 winters half convinced we would lose everything. We may still secure it, but I need your help, not your silence. If there is anything else you remember, anything Mother said, even in passing, it might matter now." Edmund was quiet for a long moment, staring at the scattered papers on his desk as though they might rearrange themselves into an answer. "She kept a small portrait once," he said finally, "of a young man she never named. I found it among her things, early in our marriage, and asked her about it only once. She told me it belonged to a part of her life that was finished, and asked me never to raise it again. I honored that request. Perhaps I should not have. Do you still have the portrait? I believe it went into the trunk, with the rest of her belongings, after she passed. I could not bring myself to look through it closely enough to find out." Eleanor thought of the false bottom in the attic trunk, the careful hiding place her mother had built for letters she could not bear to destroy, and could not risk being found. If there was a portrait, it would be there too, tucked away with the same quiet grief that had kept the letters hidden for so many years. "I will look again," she said. "But Father, I need you to trust me in this. Julian is not our enemy. I believe he wants the same thing we do, to see this matter settled honestly, without his aunt's interference." Edmund studied her for a long moment, an unreadable mixture of worry and something gentler moving behind his tired eyes. "You speak of him differently than you did 2 days ago." Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked away. "He has been honest with me, that is all." "Mind yourself, Eleanor. Honesty is not the only quality a man of his station might use to win a woman's trust, particularly a woman whose family's fortune rests so heavily on his goodwill. I am not so easily won, Father. I only wish to see this matter resolved fairly, for all our sakes, including his." Edmund did not look entirely convinced, but he let the matter rest, returning his attention to the ledgers with a heaviness that had not been there before their conversation began. Eleanor left him to his papers and climbed once more to the attic, determined to search every corner of her mother's trunk for whatever remained hidden beneath its false bottom, certain now that the portrait, if it existed, would only confirm what the letters had already made clear. Her mother's heart had carried a secret far longer and far deeper than anyone in the family had ever suspected, and it had fallen to Eleanor, of all people, to carry that secret into the light. She knelt again before the trunk, lifting away the shawls and the little box of buttons until the false bottom lay exposed beneath her fingers. This time she worked more carefully, running her hands along every seam of the wood, and near the back corner she found a second hidden space she had missed before, narrow and shallow, just large enough to hold a small folded cloth. She drew it out with trembling hands and unwrapped it slowly, already certain of what she would find before the last fold fell away. The cloth held a small oval portrait, painted in soft colors that had not entirely faded despite the years. A young man looked out from the frame, no older than 25, with dark eyes and a serious mouth that Eleanor recognized instantly, not from any memory of her own, but from a face she had seen only 2 days before, standing at a locked gate in the cold morning air. The resemblance to Julian was unmistakable, not identical, but close enough that her breath caught in her throat. This was the old Duke, painted young, kept hidden in a trunk for 30 years by a woman who could never speak his name aloud again. Eleanor wrapped the portrait carefully and carried it downstairs, along with the letters, determined now to return to the manor and lay everything before Julian at once. She did not send word ahead, she simply rode, the bundle secured against her chest beneath her cloak, and arrived as the afternoon light was beginning to lengthen across the fields. She was not shown into the study this time. Instead, the housekeeper who greeted her at the door wore an expression of poorly hidden alarm. "Miss Ashworth, His Grace is not receiving visitors at present. It is urgent. Please, only a few minutes." "I am sorry, miss. Lady Constance has given instructions." Eleanor felt a cold certainty settle over her, the same feeling she had carried since the moment Julian first mentioned his aunt's name. "Is His Grace aware of these instructions?" The housekeeper's silence was answer enough, but before Eleanor could press further, a voice cut across the entrance hall, smooth and cold as polished stone. "You must be the Ashworth girl." Lady Constance Harcourt descended the staircase with the unhurried grace of a woman who had never once in her life been made to feel unwelcome in her own home. She was tall, elegantly dressed in dark gray silk, with a face that might once have been called handsome, and had settled, with age, into something sharper. Her eyes moved over Eleanor with open assessment, the way one might examine a horse before deciding whether it was worth the asking price. "Lady Constance," Eleanor said carefully, "I had hoped to speak with the Duke. My nephew is occupied with estate business. I am certain whatever you have come to discuss can be settled just as easily with me." She descended the final steps and came to stand only a few feet away, her gaze dropping briefly to the bundle Eleanor held against her chest. You have brought something with you. Personal correspondence. Nothing that concerns the estate. How curious, then, that you rode here so urgently to deliver it. Lady Constance's smile did not reach her eyes. I understand there has been some confusion regarding the Northfield. A tiresome business. Boundary disputes. I do hope it will be resolved quickly and quietly. I hope so as well. Then perhaps you would allow me to offer some guidance from one who has managed this family's affairs for a great many years. Lady Constance's voice remained pleasant, almost warm, but there was steel beneath it that Eleanor did not miss. My nephew is young and prone to sentiment. He has, I understand, taken a particular interest in you and your family's circumstances. I would advise you not to mistake sympathy for anything more permanent. Dukes marry to secure their estates, Miss Ashworth, not to settle debts their fathers should never have incurred. Eleanor's spine straightened. I have not come here seeking a marriage, my lady. I have come seeking what belongs to my family by right. By right. Lady Constance repeated the words as though tasting something faintly unpleasant. Rights are such flexible things, are they not? Depending on who holds the paper proving them. I would be careful, my dear, about which papers you choose to trust, and which you choose to produce publicly. Scandal has a way of harming the accuser as much as the accused, particularly when the accuser's own mother is the one whose reputation hangs in the balance. The threat was delivered so smoothly that for a moment Eleanor almost missed it. Then the meaning settled, cold and unmistakable, and she understood that Lady Constance knew far more than she was letting on, and was prepared to use every piece of it as a weapon. You know about the covenant, Eleanor said quietly. Something flickered across Lady Constance's composed face, gone almost before it appeared. I know a great many things, Miss Ashworth. I know that my brother, in his final years, grew sentimental about a woman he could not have, and I know that sentiment, left unchecked, can do a great deal of damage to a family's name. I loved my brother. I will not allow his foolishness to be dragged into public view after his death, particularly not to benefit a family so eager to profit from it. My family is not seeking profit. We are seeking what your brother intended to give freely. Intentions are not law, Miss Ashworth. Documents are law, and documents can be lost, misplaced, or simply never have existed at all, depending on who tells the story. Lady Constance's smile returned, thin and final. I would advise you to take your correspondence home, keep it private, and allow this dispute to be settled through the proper legal channels, where such delicate matters as your mother's past need never be raised at all. She turned and began to ascend the staircase. The conversation apparently concluded on her terms, when Julian's voice rang out from the top of the stairs. Aunt Constance. He descended quickly, his expression thunderous in a way Eleanor had not yet seen from him. I gave no instruction that Miss Ashworth was to be turned away. I merely thought to spare you the burden of estate matters while you attend to more pressing concerns, Lady Constance said smoothly, though something tightened around her eyes at being caught. The Northfield is precisely the estate matter I am attending to. Julian's gaze moved to Eleanor, softening immediately. Forgive me, I was not told you had come. Your aunt and I were just discussing the covenant, Eleanor said, watching Lady Constance's expression carefully as she spoke the word aloud. She seems to know a great deal about it, for someone who claims such documents may never have existed. Julian turned to his aunt, and for the first time Eleanor saw something like real anger settle over his features. You know where it is. I know nothing of the sort. Aunt Constance, I have spent 2 days searching every drawer of my father's study for a document that seems to have vanished without a trace, and you stand here speaking of scandal and reputation, as though you have already read every word of it. Lady Constance's composure cracked, just slightly. Just enough for Eleanor to see the fear beneath the careful control. Your father was a fool, Julian. He nearly destroyed this family's standing once already, chasing after a woman beneath his station, and I will not stand by and watch you finish the ruin he started, whatever tender feelings you have developed for her daughter in the space of a handful of days. That is not your decision to make. It became my decision the moment your father died and left this family's reputation resting on your very young, very impressionable shoulders. Lady Constance's voice had lost its smooth composure now, sharpening into something closer to genuine anger. I have protected this family for 30 years, Julian. I will not undo that protection now because you have fallen for a pretty face and a sad story. Enough. Julian's voice cut through the hall, quiet but final, the voice of a man who had, in that moment, fully claimed the authority of his title. If you have the covenant, Aunt, I want it produced. If you do not, then I want your word that you will cease interfering in this matter entirely. Either way, this ends today. Lady Constance studied him for a long moment, something calculating moving behind her eyes. before she turned without another word and swept up the staircase, her silk skirts hissing against the stone steps. Julian watched her go, then turned back to Eleanor, some of the anger draining from his face and leaving behind something closer to exhaustion. "I am sorry. I did not expect her to confront you directly. She all but confirmed she has it, or knows where it is." "I suspected as much. My aunt has never been subtle when she believes she holds the advantage." He glanced at the bundle in Eleanor's arms. "You found something else." Eleanor unwrapped the portrait and held it out to him. Julian went very still as he looked at it, his fingers hovering just above the painted surface without quite touching it, as though the image might dissolve if handled too roughly. "This is my father," he said quietly, "younger than I ever knew him. I have never seen this portrait before. My mother kept it hidden for 30 years, alongside his letters. I do not think she ever stopped loving him, even after she married my father, even after she built a whole life that had nothing to do with the Harcourt estate." Julian looked up from the portrait, and something in his expression had shifted entirely, the careful reserve giving way to something rawer, more open. "My father spoke of regret often, in his final years, though he never explained its source. I understand now what he meant. He spent his whole life bound to an estate and a title he never truly wanted, married to a woman he respected but did not love, while the one promise that might have made him happy went unfulfilled because duty demanded otherwise. And now his son stands accused of the very same sentiment his aunt fears so deeply. Perhaps I am guilty of it." Julian's eyes held hers, steady and unguarded in a way that made her chest tighten. "I did not expect, when I locked that gate 4 days ago, that I would find myself standing here, holding my father's portrait, unable to stop thinking about the woman standing across from me." Eleanor's breath caught, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the portrait resting between them like a bridge built across 30 years of silence. Then the practical part of her mind reasserted itself, the part that had learned, over 3 hard years, never to let hope outrun caution. "We still need the covenant," she said. "Whatever either of us feels does not change the fact that my family's fortune, and the truth of my mother's history, depends on finding that document before your aunt destroys it entirely." "Agreed." Julian handed the portrait back to her carefully. "I will search my father's private study again tonight, every corner of it, and I will have the household staff question discreetly about my aunt's movements these past weeks. If she has hidden it somewhere in this house, I intend to find it before she has the chance to burn it." "And if she has already burned it?" Julian's jaw tightened. "Then we will find another way. Witnesses who knew of the arrangement, correspondence that references it even indirectly, anything that might stand as proof in place of the covenant itself. I will not allow my aunt's fear of scandal to erase a promise my father meant to keep, whatever it costs either of us." Eleanor nodded, gathering the letters and portrait back beneath her cloak, though she found herself reluctant to leave, some part of her wishing to stay in this hall a little longer, standing across from a man who had somehow, in the span of a few short days, become as tangled in her heart as he was in her family's fate. She said her farewells and rode home through the gathering dusk, aware that the battle ahead had only grown more urgent and more dangerous, now that Lady Constance knew exactly how much Eleanor and Julian had already uncovered. That night, Julian kept his word. Long after the household had retired, he lit a single candle and returned to his father's study, the same room where the old Duke had spent his final years surrounded by ledgers and correspondence he rarely allowed anyone else to touch. Julian had searched it once before, quickly, distracted by grief and the sudden weight of his new title. This time he searched it properly, drawer by drawer, shelf by shelf, running his hands along the backs of cabinets and beneath the lining of old boxes in case something had been tucked away out of easy sight. He found nothing in the desk itself, though he did find, folded into the back of an old account book, a single sheet of paper in his father's handwriting that made his chest tighten. It was not the covenant, only a private note, unfinished and unsent, addressed to no one in particular, as though the old Duke had written it simply to organize his own thoughts. "I have wronged Margaret twice," the note read. "Once when I let duty separate us, and again when I let fear keep me from making it right while there was still time. If Julian reads this after I am gone, I hope he will finish what I could not. The field is the smallest part of what I owe her. I only pray it is not too late to give her family what should have always been theirs." Julian sat with the note for a long time, the candle burning lower, before he folded it carefully and placed it inside his coat. It was not proof enough to settle the dispute on its own, but it confirmed everything Eleanor's letters had already suggested, and it strengthened his resolve to see the matter through no matter what obstacles his aunt placed in his path. He continued searching until well past midnight, moving from the study to the old Duke's private sitting room, then to a locked cabinet in the library that took considerable effort to open. Inside, he found stacks of old correspondence, none of it relevant, and a collection of estate maps that had not been consulted in years. Frustration began to gnaw at him as the hours passed without success, and he was on the point of abandoning the search until morning, when he noticed something odd about the cabinet itself. The back panel, when he pressed against it, gave slightly beneath his hand, as though it were not fully secured to the frame. He worked at the edges carefully, and after several minutes of careful effort, the panel came away entirely, revealing a narrow space behind it, barely large enough to hold a single folded document. Julian's hands were not entirely steady as he reached inside, and drew out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age, his father's wax seal still intact upon the flap. He did not open it immediately. He simply held it, feeling the weight of 30 years pressing against his palm, before finally breaking the seal and unfolding the paper within. It was not the covenant. It was a letter, written by his father to Lady Constance herself, dated only a few months before his death, and its contents explained more than Julian had expected to learn in a single night. "Constance," the letter began, "I know you disapprove of what I intend to do, and I know you believe it will bring shame upon this family. I ask you, as my sister and the only person I trust to see this handled with discretion, to ensure the covenant reaches Margaret's family after I am gone, should I not live long enough to see it filed properly myself. I have placed it with the estate's solicitor in London, along with instructions to release it upon my death or upon Julian's direct request as the new Duke. I trust you will not interfere with this arrangement, whatever your private feelings on the matter may be." Julian read the letter twice, his pulse quickening with each pass. The covenant was not hidden in this house at all. It had been placed with the family's solicitor in London from the very beginning, meant to be released automatically, and his aunt had known it all along, had perhaps spent these past days deliberately misdirecting him and Eleanor both, allowing them to search a house that held nothing while the true document sat waiting, untouched, in a solicitor's office less than a day's ride away. He rose from the cabinet with the letter clutched in his hand, anger and hope warring in equal measure within his chest. If his aunt had known where the covenant truly lay, then her talk of scandal and reputation had been nothing more than a delaying tactic, an attempt to frighten Eleanor into abandoning the claim before the truth could be properly established through legal channels she could not control. He would need to travel to London himself, and soon, before his aunt found some way to intercept the solicitor, or delay the covenant's release through some legal maneuver of her own devising. But first he needed to tell Eleanor what he had found, needed her to know that the ground beneath their feet had shifted entirely in their favor, even if the path ahead remained far from certain. He did not sleep that night. Instead, he sat at his father's desk until dawn broke over the fields beyond the window, turning the letter over in his hands again and again, thinking of a woman he had known for only a handful of days who had somehow become the center of every thought he carried, and of a father whose regret had outlived him, waiting 30 years to finally be set right. Eleanor was still asleep when the sound of hooves on the gravel drive woke her before dawn. She reached the window in time to see Julian dismounting in the gray morning light, his coat rumpled as though he had not changed it since the previous evening, his face drawn with exhaustion and something that looked, even from a distance, like urgency. She dressed quickly and met him in the front hall before her father had even stirred. "You found something," she said. "I found where the covenant is kept, though not the document itself." Julian's voice was rough with lack of sleep, but his eyes were bright with purpose. "It was never hidden in the manor at all. My father placed it with the family's solicitor in London before he died, with instructions that it be released upon his death, or at my direct request." "Then why has it not already reached us?" "Because I did not know to ask for it, and because my aunt, I suspect, has spent every day since my father's death hoping I never would." Julian withdrew the letter from his coat and handed it to her. "She has known all along where it rests. Her talk of scandal and lost documents was meant only to frighten you into abandoning the claim before I discovered the truth." Eleanor read the letter twice, her anger rising with each line, though it was tempered by relief that finally, after days of uncertainty, they had found solid ground to stand on. "You must go to London. I intend to leave within the hour. I only wish to tell you first, and to ask whether you would accompany me." The question caught her off guard. "Your aunt will not allow it." "My aunt does not govern my decisions, and she certainly does not govern yours." Something steady and certain had settled into his voice since the previous night, a resolve that had not been there when Eleanor first met him at the locked gate. This document concerns your family as much as mine. You have every right to be present when it is finally retrieved." Eleanor thought of her father, still asleep upstairs, unaware that the field he had spent 3 anxious years defending might already belong to them by right, waiting only for a piece of paper to confirm it. She thought of her mother's letters, hidden for 30 years, and the portrait of a young man whose face she now saw echoed so clearly in his son's. "I will need to tell my father where I am going," she said. "He deserves to know, even if the truth is difficult for him to hear." Edmund did not take the news well. When Eleanor explained what Julian had discovered, her father sat in stunned silence for a long moment before anger overtook him, not at Eleanor, but at circumstances that had kept such a significant truth buried for so many years. 30 years, he said finally, his voice hoarse. 30 years, I have wondered about a portrait I was too afraid to ask about. And all this time the answer was sitting in a London office, waiting. "Father, I know this is difficult." "It is not difficult, Eleanor. It is simply late." He rose from his chair, some of the old vigor returning to his movements despite the gray in his hair and the tiredness in his eyes. "If this covenant exists, and if it secures the field for our family as the Duke believes, then I intend to be present when it is retrieved. Your mother deserves that much, even if she is no longer here to see it." And so it was decided that all 3 of them would travel to London together, Edmund insisting on accompanying his daughter despite his own exhaustion, unwilling to let her face this journey without him after so many years of unintentional distance on the subject of her mother's past. The journey took the better part of 2 days, the carriage rattling over uneven roads while the countryside gave way slowly to the crowded streets and constant noise of the city. Eleanor watched the passing scenery with a strange, unsettled feeling in her chest, caught between hope and the fear that something might yet go wrong, that Lady Constance might find some way to intercept them before they reached the solicitor's office. That fear proved well-founded. When they arrived at the offices of Pratt and Aldwych, the family's solicitors for 3 generations, they were met not by the clerk they expected, but by a stern-faced older man who introduced himself as Mr. Aldwych himself, and who regarded the 3 of them with obvious discomfort. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Julian with a slight bow, "I regret to inform you that Lady Constance visited this office only yesterday, claiming authority to review your father's private papers on your behalf." Julian's expression darkened. "I gave her no such authority. She presented a letter suggesting otherwise, Your Grace, bearing what appeared to be your seal. I had no reason at the time to doubt its authenticity. The seal was forged, or taken without my knowledge. What did she take?" Mr. Aldwich's discomfort deepened visibly. "She reviewed several files pertaining to your father's private arrangements, including, I believe, a sealed document addressed for release to a Mrs. Margaret Ashworth or her heirs, dated some 3 years before your father's death." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Is the document still here?" "I am afraid Lady Constance requested to take a copy for review, citing family business that required her attention. The original remains in our safekeeping, as our procedures require, but the copy has left this office, and I could not tell you what use she intends to make of it." Julian's jaw tightened, a muscle working visibly beneath his skin. "I want the original released to me now, as my father's letter instructed, and I want a full accounting of everything my aunt removed or reviewed during her visit." Mr. Aldwych hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Of course, Your Grace. I will have the original prepared immediately. As for your aunt's activities, I can provide what records exist, though I confess I do not know what she intends to do with the copy she has taken." While the solicitor's clerks prepared the necessary papers, Eleanor paced the small waiting room, her mind racing through the possibilities. If Lady Constance had a copy of the covenant, she might destroy it, though the original remained safe here regardless. More troubling was the question of what else she might do with the knowledge it contained, particularly the details of her brother's broken engagement and the scandal she had spent 30 years trying to bury. "She means to use it against us somehow," Eleanor said quietly, as Julian joined her by the window. "She would not have taken the trouble to copy it merely out of curiosity." "I agree." Julian's expression was grim. "My aunt has spent her entire life protecting this family's reputation above all else. If she believes releasing the covenant publicly will cause more damage than concealing it ever could, she may attempt to control how and when the truth becomes known, perhaps even twisting it into something that serves her own purposes rather than ours. What purposes could she possibly have left, now that the original is safely in your hands? I do not know, but my aunt has never been a woman to accept defeat gracefully, and I would be a fool to assume she has given up simply because we have reached the solicitor before she could destroy the evidence entirely." Edmund, who had been listening quietly from a nearby chair, spoke up for the first time since their arrival. Whatever she intends, we should return home as quickly as possible, document in hand. Whatever mischief she plans will be easier to counter on our own ground than here in London, where none of us know the full extent of her connections or influence. Julian nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he was already turning over darker possibilities in his mind, calculating the shape of a threat he could not yet fully see. The original covenant was placed into Julian's hands within the hour, sealed with his father's wax and witnessed, according to Mr. Aldwych, by two independent parties whose signatures still remained legible at the document's foot. Eleanor watched Julian's face as he read through it for the first time, watched the tension in his shoulders ease slightly as the words confirmed everything they had hoped to find. The field granted outright to Margaret Ashworth and her heirs, free of any claim from the Harcourt estate, in restitution for a promise broken 30 years before. "It is genuine," Julian said quietly, passing the document to Eleanor with careful hands, as though it might yet dissolve if handled too roughly. "Every word of it. The field has been yours by right since before your parents ever married." Eleanor read the covenant through tears she had not expected, her mother's story finally given the weight of law, rather than whispered secrets kept hidden in a trunk for 30 years. But even as relief washed over her, she could not shake the unease Julian's warning had planted. The certainty that Lady Constance would not simply accept this outcome without one final attempt to twist events back in her favor. They left London that same afternoon, the covenant secured carefully among Julian's private papers, all three of them anxious to return home before whatever scheme Lady Constance had set in motion could fully take shape. The carriage ride back felt longer than the journey out, every mile heavy with the knowledge that their victory, however genuine, might not yet be entirely secure. They stopped for the night at a coaching inn, roughly halfway between London and home, too exhausted to press on further without rest. Edmund retired early, his energy finally spent after 2 days of travel and revelation, leaving Eleanor and Julian alone in the small private parlor the innkeeper had arranged for them. For a while neither spoke, the fire crackling softly between them, the weight of the day settling slowly into something quieter and more personal than the urgency that had carried them through London. "You have not asked me what I intend to do once the field is secured," Julian said finally, breaking the silence. "I assumed the matter would end there. The land returns to my family, the covenant stands as proof, and your aunt has no further claim to make." "That is the legal matter, yes." Julian's eyes found hers across the small room, steady and unguarded in the firelight. "I meant something else." Eleanor's pulse quickened, though she kept her voice carefully even. "I do not know what else there is to discuss." "I think you do." He rose from his chair and crossed the short distance between them, stopping a respectful distance away, though the air between them felt charged with something neither of them had yet named aloud. "Eleanor, these past days have changed everything I believed about my own life. I inherited a title I never wanted, tied to duties and expectations that felt, until recently, like a weight I would carry alone for the rest of my days. Then I met you, at a locked gate, angry and unafraid, and something in me shifted that I have not been able to shift back since. Julian, I am not asking you for anything tonight. I only wished you to know that whatever happens with the covenant, whatever my aunt attempts next, my feelings toward you are not born of guilt over my father's broken promise, nor pity for your family's circumstances. They are entirely my own, and they have grown stronger with every hour I have spent in your company." Eleanor's throat tightened with an emotion she had not expected to feel so strongly. Gratitude tangled together with something warmer, something she had been carefully refusing to examine since the moment he first spoke to her at the gate. "I have spent 3 years guarding myself against exactly this sort of feeling," she admitted quietly. "Hope has not served my family well these past years. I have learned to expect disappointment rather than invite it. Then let me be the exception to that expectation." Julian's voice was low, earnest, entirely without the careful reserve he had worn like armor during their first meetings. "I cannot promise you an easy path. My aunt will not surrender gracefully, and whatever scandal she fears from our father's history may yet touch us both before this is finished. But I can promise you honesty and loyalty, and a willingness to fight for what is right rather than what is convenient." Eleanor studied his face for a long moment, searching for any trace of the calculation Lady Constance had accused him of, and finding none. Only sincerity, tired and hopeful in equal measure, matching something she recognized rising within her own chest. "I do not know what tomorrow will bring," she said finally, "but I find I no longer wish to guard myself against you, Julian, whatever the cost of that honesty proves to be." Something eased in his expression, relief and warmth breaking through the exhaustion of the long journey, and for a moment the small parlor felt entirely separate from the danger waiting for them at home, from Lady Constance's schemes and the uncertain future still ahead. It was only a moment, brief and fragile, but Eleanor held on to it carefully as they said their goodnights and retired to separate rooms, aware that whatever waited for them upon their return, she no longer faced it entirely alone. She lay awake long after the candle had burned down, listening to the muffled sounds of the inn settling into night, turning Julian's words over in her mind, until they had worn a warm and familiar place there. Whatever Lady Constance had planned, whatever fresh trouble waited for them along the road home, Eleanor found that for the first time in 3 difficult years, she faced the future without the old, familiar dread pressing against her chest. In its place sat something fragile but real, a hope she had almost forgotten how to hold. They reached the manor by late afternoon the following day, and the moment the carriage rolled through the gates, Eleanor knew something had changed. Servants moved with unusual haste across the grounds, and a small crowd of curious neighbors had gathered near the drive, whispering among themselves in a way that made her stomach tighten with dread. Julian was out of the carriage before it had fully stopped, striding toward the front entrance with a grim set to his jaw. Eleanor followed close behind, her father not far after her, and they found Lady Constance waiting in the entrance hall, composed and unhurried, as though she had been expecting their arrival for hours. "You have returned sooner than I anticipated," Lady Constance said. "What have you done?" Julian's voice was low, dangerous in a way Eleanor had not heard from him before. "I have done nothing but tell the truth, nephew. A truth that was, I might add, already close to becoming common knowledge, given how carelessly you and Miss Ashworth have conducted your investigations these past days. Explain yourself." Lady Constance's composure did not waver. "I have informed several members of the local gentry of the unfortunate circumstances surrounding your father's youthful indiscretions, and the rather convenient covenant that has surfaced in their wake, granting land to the very family whose daughter you now appear to be courting. I thought it only fair that the neighborhood understand the full context before rumors distorted it into something worse." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "You told them about my mother." "I told them the facts, dressed in language considerably kinder than what the local gossips will invent on their own, given time." Lady Constance's eyes moved to Eleanor with something almost like pity, though there was nothing gentle in her tone. "I suspect you will find, my dear, that being known as the daughter of a woman who nearly ruined a duke's engagement 30 years ago is not the sort of distinction that improves a young lady's prospects, whatever sympathy the current duke may feel toward your circumstances. You did this deliberately," Julian said, "to poison the truth before it could stand on its own merit. I did this to protect you from your own foolishness, though I did not expect gratitude for the effort." Lady Constance's mask slipped slightly, genuine frustration bleeding through. "Julian, I have watched you for 4 days now, chasing after a girl and a scandal with equal recklessness, and I have done what I believed necessary to limit the damage, before it consumed this family entirely. If the neighborhood already knows the shape of the story, they will be far less inclined to treat the covenant's release as some grand romantic revelation, and far more inclined to see it as exactly what it is: a settlement of old debts, nothing more. You have humiliated her family for no purpose beyond protecting your own comfort. I have done what was necessary." Lady Constance's voice hardened. "You may resent me for it now, but you will thank me in time, when this scandal fades into forgotten gossip rather than a permanent stain on the Harcourt name, and on hers as well." Eleanor's hands trembled at her sides, humiliation and fury warring within her chest. She thought of her father, standing silently beside her, absorbing this fresh blow atop everything else he had learned these past days about his late wife's history. She thought of the neighbors gathered outside, already whispering, already reshaping her mother's private grief into public entertainment. "You had no right," Eleanor said, her voice shaking despite her effort to keep it steady. "My mother is not here to defend herself. She kept this secret for 30 years because she understood exactly what small minds would do with it, and you have handed it to them freely, without a single thought for what it might cost the people left behind to bear the consequences." Something in Eleanor's words seemed to land differently than Julian's anger had, and for the briefest moment, Lady Constance's composure faltered entirely, a flicker of genuine discomfort crossing her sharp features before she mastered it again. "I am sorry for the manner in which this has unfolded," she said, though the apology sounded stiff and unpracticed, as though she rarely had occasion to offer one. "But I will not apologize for protecting this family's future, however unpleasant the method. There is a difference between protecting a family and destroying a young woman's reputation to spare yourself discomfort. Edmund said quietly, speaking for the first time since their arrival. His voice carried none of Julian's fury, only a weary, dignified sorrow that seemed to affect Lady Constance more deeply than any amount of shouting might have. My wife loved this family's estate enough to keep its secrets even in death. I would have hoped that loyalty might have been returned, if not to her, then at least to her daughter. Lady Constance said nothing for a long moment, her eyes moving between Edmund's quiet grief and Eleanor's barely contained anger, something shifting behind her composed exterior that none of them could quite read. "The damage is done," she said finally. "I cannot undo what has already spread through the neighborhood, but I will tell you this, Miss Ashworth. Whatever whispers you hear in the coming days, they will fade faster than you expect, provided the truth is allowed to stand plainly, rather than twisted further by silence and speculation. If you wish to counter the damage, the covenant itself is your strongest defense, proof that this was a matter of honor fulfilled, not scandal invented. That is remarkably practical advice, coming from the woman who created the problem," Julian said coldly. "I am nothing if not practical, nephew. It is precisely why this family has survived as long as it has." Lady Constance drew herself up, some of her earlier composure returning despite the tension still thick in the hall. "I will make no further attempts to interfere with the covenant or its release. You have my word on that much at least. What you and Miss Ashworth choose to do with the rest of this unfortunate situation is entirely your own affair." She swept from the hall without waiting for a response, leaving the four of them standing in tense silence, the weight of the afternoon's revelations settling heavily over the household. "I am sorry," Julian said quietly, once his aunt's footsteps had faded up the staircase. "I never anticipated she would go this far." "It is not your doing." Eleanor's voice still trembled, though anger had begun to give way to something closer to exhaustion. "But I do not know how to face the neighborhood now, knowing every word my mother tried so hard to bury has become common conversation over tea. Then we face it together, and we face it with the truth rather than allowing rumor to shape the story in our absence." Julian's voice was steady, determined. "The covenant proves this was a debt of honor, fulfilled at last, not some scandal to be whispered about in corners. If we present it plainly, publicly, there will be little room left for gossip to twist it into something uglier." Edmund nodded slowly, some of the weariness in his face giving way to quiet resolve. "Your mother spent her whole life protecting this family from difficulty, Eleanor, in ways I am only now beginning to fully understand. Perhaps it is time we stopped hiding from difficulty ourselves and let the truth stand on its own, however uncomfortable that proves to be." Eleanor looked between her father and Julian, feeling something steady settle over the anger and humiliation that had gripped her only moments before. She thought of her mother's letters, hidden for 30 years out of fear rather than shame, and found herself unwilling to let that same fear govern her own choices now that the truth had finally come to light. "Then let us do exactly that," she said. "Let us make the covenant public, properly, on our own terms, before your aunt's version of events becomes the only one anyone remembers." Julian's expression eased into something like relief, though the tension of the afternoon had not entirely left him. "I will speak with the local magistrate first thing tomorrow, and arrange for the covenant to be properly registered and witnessed before the wider neighborhood. If we act quickly, we can shape how this story is understood, before too much damage sets in from my aunt's premature announcement." "And I will speak with our neighbors directly," Eleanor added, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own resolve. "I have spent enough years watching my family retreat from difficulty. I do not intend to spend the rest of my life doing the same." The plan settled something uneasy in the room, though Eleanor could not fully shake the sting of Lady Constance's actions, nor the knowledge that whatever whispers had already begun circulating through the neighborhood would take time and careful effort to counter. Still, as she looked at Julian's steady determination and her father's quiet, renewed strength, she felt something she had not expected to feel after such a difficult homecoming, a fragile but genuine sense that this trial, unlike so many before it, might yet be one they could face and overcome together, rather than alone. That evening, after her father had retired and the household had finally quieted, Eleanor walked out to the very field that had started this entire chain of events, the chained gate now standing open at Julian's order, the soil dark and rich beneath the fading evening light. She stood at the boundary where she had first met him only days before, and found herself thinking not of scandal or humiliation, but of her mother, young and hopeful, standing perhaps in this very spot decades ago, making a promise with a man she could not marry, never knowing how many years would pass before that promise finally found its way home. Footsteps sounded behind her on the soft grass, and she did not need to turn to know it was Julian. He came to stand beside her at the fence, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the cooling evening air, though he made no move to close the remaining distance between them. "I thought I might find you here," he said. It felt right to come back to where this began. Eleanor kept her eyes on the darkening horizon. "I keep thinking of her, standing somewhere near this very spot, young and unaware of everything the years would take from her. She never got to see this resolved. She never knew the covenant would eventually come home. Perhaps she knew it would, eventually, even if she did not live to see it herself." Julian's voice was gentle. She kept the letters, the portrait, everything that mattered. She did not destroy them, even after 30 years of silence. I think some part of her believed the truth would find its way out eventually, whatever it cost her in the meantime. Eleanor considered this, turning it over in her mind the way she had turned over so many uncertain thoughts these past difficult days. "I used to believe my mother was simply a private woman, quiet by nature, content with a small life on a small estate. I never imagined she carried something this large inside her, hidden away where none of us could see it. Grief has a way of teaching people to hide their largest feelings behind their quietest habits." Julian's gaze drifted toward the darkening fields beyond the fence. "My father was the same, in his own way. Everyone believed him a serious, dutiful man, entirely devoted to the estate and its obligations. Few people ever guessed that beneath that duty lived 30 years of regret for a choice he did not make freely." "Do you think they ever saw each other again, after they married others?" "I do not know. The letters your mother kept were dated across many years, which suggests some manner of correspondence continued, even if only occasionally, even if only to check on each other's welfare from a careful distance." Julian glanced at her. "Does that trouble you? The thought that they might have maintained some connection even after both had married?" Eleanor considered the question honestly before answering. "I think it troubled me at first, before I understood the full shape of their story. Now I find I only feel sorrow for both of them, for the years of happiness duty and circumstance denied them, and gratitude that my own mother chose, in the end, to build a genuine life with my father, whatever unfinished feelings she carried alongside it." "Your father seems to have made his peace with it as well, faster than I expected. My father has spent 3 years learning that survival sometimes requires setting pride aside in favor of practical necessity. I think he has simply extended that same hard lesson to this new truth about my mother's past. He loved her deeply, whatever came before him. I do not think that love has changed, even now that he understands it was not entirely uncomplicated." They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, the last light fading fully from the sky, stars beginning to emerge overhead one by one. Eleanor found herself acutely aware of how close Julian stood, of the warmth radiating from him despite the growing chill in the evening air, and she did not step away when his hand found hers gently against the fence rail. "Whatever the neighborhood says in the coming days," Julian said quietly, "whatever gossip my aunt's carelessness has already set in motion, I want you to know that none of it changes how I feel about you, or about your family. If anything, learning the full truth of my father's history has only made me more certain of what I want for my own future." "And what is that?" "A life built on honesty, rather than duty alone. A marriage, should I be so fortunate as to find the right partner for it, built on genuine affection rather than mere convenience or estate considerations." His fingers tightened gently around hers. "I do not say this lightly, Eleanor, nor do I say it only because the covenant has bound our families' histories together so unexpectedly. I say it because these past days, difficult as they have been, have shown me exactly the kind of woman I hope to spend my life beside." Eleanor's heart raced at his words, though caution still tugged at the edges of her hope. 3 hard years of disappointment not so easily forgotten even in the face of such sincere affection. "It is too soon for such declarations, Julian. We have known each other only a handful of days, however eventful they have proven to be." "I do not disagree. I am not asking for any promise tonight, only offering you the truth of my own heart, so that you might carry it alongside everything else these past days have revealed." He released her hand gently, stepping back just enough to give her room to breathe, though the warmth of the moment lingered between them still. "Take whatever time you need, Eleanor. I intend to prove myself worthy of your trust through actions rather than words alone, however long that proof requires." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment in the gathering darkness, something settling gently in her chest that felt remarkably like the beginning of hope rather than its familiar absence. "Thank you," she said softly, "for giving me that time, and for standing beside my family through all of this, when you might easily have let your aunt's caution guide you toward an easier path instead. There was never any easier path I wished to take, not once I understood what was truly at stake." Julian's smile in the darkness was warm, genuine. entirely without the careful reserve he had worn during their very first meeting at this same fence. "Come. It grows cold, and your father will worry if you remain out here much longer. Tomorrow brings enough difficulty without adding a chill to the list of your troubles." They walked back toward the house together in comfortable silence, the chained gate standing open behind them for the first time in days, and Eleanor found herself thinking, as she climbed the steps to her own front door, that whatever difficulties tomorrow held, she no longer faced them with the same hollow dread that had defined her life these past 3 years. Something had shifted, quietly and completely, somewhere between a locked gate and a fence in the darkness, and she was not yet ready to name it, though she suspected, with each passing day, she would find it harder and harder to deny. Word of the covenant spread through the neighborhood exactly as quickly as Julian had predicted, though not entirely in the manner Lady Constance's premature gossip had shaped. Within 3 days, the local magistrate had reviewed and formally registered the document, and Julian had arranged a small gathering at the manor, inviting the same families who had already heard whispered fragments of the story, determined that they should hear the whole truth plainly, rather than continue trading half-formed rumors over tea. Eleanor dressed carefully that morning, her hands unsteady as she fastened the buttons of her best dress, aware that today would determine, in large part, how her family and her mother's memory would be regarded by the community for years to come. Her father waited for her at the bottom of the stairs, dressed in his finest coat despite its slightly worn cuffs, his expression a careful mixture of nervousness and quiet pride. "Your mother would be proud of you today," he said, offering his arm. "Whatever comes of this gathering, you have faced it with more courage than I managed these past 3 years. We face it together, Father. That has made all the difference." They arrived at the manor to find a modest crowd already gathered in the drawing room, familiar faces from church and market day, some curious, some openly skeptical, a few sympathetic. Lady Constance stood near the window, composed as ever, though she made no move to interfere as Julian rose to address the assembled guests. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "I understand that fragments of a story have already reached you, distorted, I fear, by hasty telling and understandable speculation. I have asked you here today so that you might hear the complete truth, plainly stated, rather than continue to guess at pieces that were never meant to cause anyone shame." He proceeded to explain the history carefully. The broken engagement between his father and Margaret Ashworth 30 years before, the marriages each had ultimately made out of duty and practical necessity, and the covenant his father had drawn up in his final years, seeking to make right a debt of honor rather than conceal any scandal. He held up the sealed document itself as he spoke, its wax seal and witnessed signatures visible to anyone who cared to examine them closely. "This is not a story of impropriety," Julian said firmly, his eyes moving across the assembled faces. "It is a story of 2 people who loved each other honestly in their youth, who were separated by circumstances neither of them chose, and who each went on to build genuine, faithful lives with other partners. My father's final wish was simply to see an old debt of honor settled fairly, nothing more, nothing less. I would ask that you extend to Miss Ashworth and her family the same respect and welcome you have always shown them, understanding that whatever happened 30 years ago reflects no dishonor upon her, her mother, or her father, all of whom conducted themselves with more grace than the circumstances perhaps deserved." A murmur moved through the room, some skeptical still, but many nodding slowly, as the plain, undramatic truth settled over the earlier gossip and softened its sharper edges. Eleanor stood beside her father, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room, and found, to her surprise, that she could meet each one without flinching. The fear that had gripped her only days before, replaced now by something steadier, born of having faced the worst of it and found it survivable. One of the older women present, a longtime friend of her mother's from church gatherings, stepped forward first, her expression softening into genuine sympathy. "Margaret always seemed to carry some private sorrow beneath her kindness," she said quietly. "I am glad to finally understand its source, and gladder still that it has found some manner of resolution, however late it has come." Others followed her example, offering quiet words of understanding rather than judgment, and though Eleanor knew some whispers would inevitably persist in corners she could not control, the worst of the danger Lady Constance's carelessness had created seemed, gradually, to ease into something more manageable. Lady Constance herself said little throughout the gathering, though Eleanor caught her watching the proceedings with an expression that seemed, for the first time since they had met, closer to genuine reflection than calculated control. When the guests had finally begun to depart, satisfied with the truth they had come seeking, Lady Constance approached Eleanor directly, her posture stiff, but her voice, for once, without its usual edge of superiority. I judged you unfairly, she said, without preamble. I believed you sought to profit from my brother's guilt, to use my nephew's sympathy for your own family's advancement. I see now that I was wrong, and that whatever affection has grown between you and Julian appears genuine rather than calculated. Thank you for saying so, Eleanor replied carefully, still wary of trusting the sudden shift in the older woman's manner. I do not offer this admission easily, Miss Ashworth. I have spent 30 years protecting this family from scandal, real and imagined, and old habits do not release their grip simply because circumstances have proven them unnecessary in this particular instance. Lady Constance's gaze moved briefly toward Julian, who stood across the room speaking with departing guests. He cares for you deeply. I have watched him closely enough these past days to recognize genuine feeling when I see it. However much I may have doubted its wisdom initially, I would ask only that you treat that feeling with the seriousness it deserves, whatever path the two of you ultimately choose to walk. I intend to, Eleanor said simply, and something in her tone seemed to satisfy Lady Constance enough that she offered a small, stiff nod before withdrawing to oversee the departing guests, leaving Eleanor to reflect on how quickly circumstances had shifted from open hostility to this cautious, unexpected truce. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood's initial curiosity faded gradually into acceptance, exactly as Julian had predicted, the plain truth proving far less scandalous than the distorted whispers Lady Constance's carelessness had first set in motion. The field itself was formally transferred into the Ashworth family's name, the boundary fence removed entirely now that no dispute remained to justify its existence, and Edmund found himself, for the first time in 3 years, able to plan for the coming planting season without the constant weight of financial dread hanging over every decision. Julian and Eleanor continued to see each other throughout those weeks, their courtship growing steadily and openly now that the shadow of scandal no longer hung over every meeting. He called at the Ashworth house regularly, sometimes for tea, sometimes simply to walk the newly unbounded fields together, and Eleanor found herself, gradually and without quite realizing when it had happened, entirely unable to imagine her life continuing without him in it. It was on a mild afternoon in early autumn, nearly 2 months after the Covenant's public revelation, that Julian found her once again at the same fence where their story had first begun, though the chain and lock had long since been removed, leaving only open fields stretching between the two properties that had once been so bitterly divided. I have been thinking, he said, coming to stand beside her, about how strange it is that this field, once the source of so much conflict between our families, has become instead the place where everything good between us seems to happen. Perhaps that is simply what land does, over enough time, Eleanor replied, smiling. It remembers everything that happens upon it, the conflict and the resolution both, and eventually settles into whatever purpose proves most lasting. I hope it remembers this moment particularly well then. Julian turned to face her fully, something nervous and hopeful moving behind his steady eyes. Eleanor, these past 2 months have confirmed everything I felt that evening at the fence when I first told you my heart. I do not wish to spend my life managing an estate and a title without you beside me to share it. I do not wish for any future that does not include you at its very center. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small ring, simple but elegant, clearly chosen with care rather than mere obligation to custom. I am asking you, properly this time, without the shadow of scandal or urgency hanging over the question, will you marry me, Eleanor? Not because our family's histories have tangled themselves together so unexpectedly, but because I love you, plainly and completely, and cannot imagine building any future that does not include you in it. Eleanor felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, joy overwhelming the careful caution she had maintained these past 3 difficult years. She thought of her mother, young and hopeful once at this very spot, denied the future she might have chosen freely, and felt a fierce gratitude that her own story, unlike her mother's, would not end in quiet, buried regret. Yes, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. Yes, Julian, I will marry you. He slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly despite his earlier composure, and when he drew her into his arms, Eleanor felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely at peace with the future stretching out before her. The months leading up to the wedding brought their own quiet challenges, though none so severe as those they had already weathered together. Edmund, freed at last from the constant burden of financial worry, threw himself into improving the estate with an energy Eleanor had not seen in him since before her mother's death, repairing fences long neglected, investing carefully in new seed for the coming season, and slowly rebuilding the modest prosperity that had once defined the family before hardship wore it away. Julian, for his part, worked steadily to repair the strained relationship with his aunt, understanding that whatever her faults, she had spent 30 years genuinely devoted to the family's welfare, however misguided her methods had sometimes proven. Lady Constance gradually softened toward Eleanor as the months passed, her initial suspicion giving way first to grudging respect and eventually to something that, if not quite warmth, at least resembled genuine acceptance. She took to visiting the Ashworth household occasionally, offering advice on estate matters that Edmund, to his credit, received with far more patience than her earlier interference might have warranted. Eleanor spent many of those months preparing not only for her wedding, but for the new responsibilities that would come with becoming a duchess, a role she approached with the same practical determination that had carried her family through 3 difficult years. She studied estate management alongside Julian, learned the names and circumstances of every tenant family on Harcourt land, and made it her particular concern that no other family should ever suffer the kind of prolonged uncertainty her own had endured over a boundary dispute that honesty could have resolved decades sooner. There were quieter moments too, unhurried afternoons spent walking the fields together, evenings spent reading aloud by the fire while autumn gave way slowly to winter and then, at last, to the first green signs of spring. Julian gave her, one evening, the unfinished note his father had left behind, the one confessing his regret over the broken promise, and Eleanor kept it afterward alongside her mother's letters, the two halves of an old, unfinished story finally reunited after 30 years apart. "I used to think," she told him one evening, as they sat together watching the last light fade from the sky, "that love which cannot be acted upon simply withers away, forgotten with enough time and distance. I understand now that it does not. It simply waits, patient and quiet, until circumstances finally allow it to breathe again. Then perhaps our own children, someday, will understand something neither of our parents fully grasped," Julian replied softly, taking her hand in his. "That duty and love need not stand opposed to one another, provided we are brave enough to insist upon both." Their wedding took place the following spring, in the small church that had witnessed both families for generations, attended by neighbors who had, by then, long since moved past the scandal of 30 years prior, to embrace instead the genuine happiness of the young couple standing before them. Edmund walked his daughter down the aisle with tears he made no effort to hide, and Lady Constance, seated near the front despite her earlier reservations, watched the ceremony with an expression that suggested she had, at last, made a full and genuine peace with everything the past months had revealed. Eleanor thought often, in the years that followed, of her mother's letters, still kept safely in the very trunk where she had first discovered them, alongside the small portrait that had started everything. She had made her peace with her mother's hidden history, understanding now that love delayed was not love denied, that even a promise broken by circumstance could, given enough time and enough courage, eventually find its way home. The field itself remained a source of quiet pride throughout their marriage, its rich soil yielding good harvests year after year, a lasting symbol of a debt finally settled, and a love finally allowed to flourish openly, exactly as it should have been permitted to do 30 years before. Eleanor often walked its boundaries in the early morning light, remembering the locked gate that had first brought her and Julian together, grateful beyond words that a chain meant to divide 2 families had instead become the very thing that united them completely. In the years that followed, Eleanor took particular care to ensure her mother's story was remembered honestly, rather than left to fade into vague, half-forgotten rumor. She had the old portrait framed properly and hung it, alongside a portrait of her mother painted from memory by a skilled local artist, in a quiet corner of the manor library, where both faces could look out together at last, no longer separated by circumstance or silence. Visitors sometimes asked about the pairing, and Eleanor found she no longer hesitated to tell the story plainly, understanding now that there was no shame in it, only a long overdue honesty that had finally been allowed to see daylight. Edmund lived many more years after that difficult season, watching his daughter's family grow, with a contentment he had not known was still possible for him after her mother's death. He grew close to Julian in a way that surprised them both, the 2 men finding common ground first in shared concern for Eleanor's happiness, and later in genuine friendship, bonded by everything they had weathered together during those tense days in London, and the difficult homecoming that followed. Lady Constance, too, found her place gradually within the family she had once guarded so fiercely against outside influence. She became, in time, a frequent presence at the manor, offering counsel that Eleanor learned to value even when she did not always agree with it, and taking a particular, unexpected delight in the children, who eventually filled the halls where scandal and secrecy had once cast such a long shadow. Eleanor never forgot the morning she had stood at that locked gate, certain her family's fortune and her own future had come to ruin at the hands of a stranger's cold ambition. She thought, often, of how easily that first meeting might have gone differently, how easily fear or pride might have kept both families locked in bitter dispute, rather than opening, eventually, into genuine understanding and lasting love. It seemed to her, looking back across the years, that the greatest inheritance her mother had ever left behind was not the field itself, valuable as it proved to be, but the quiet, patient hope that had waited 30 years to be fulfilled, teaching her daughter in the end that some promises, however delayed, are worth every year spent waiting for them to finally come home. 10 years passed, and the manor that had once echoed with tension and hidden secrets now rang instead with the sound of children's laughter. Eleanor and Julian had 3 of them by then, 2 boys and a girl, all raised on stories of the locked gate and the covenant that had nearly kept 2 families apart, told not as scandal but as history, plainly and without shame. It was their eldest son, Henry, barely 9 years old, who first noticed the letter arriving one autumn morning, addressed to his mother in unfamiliar handwriting, the seal pressed with a crest neither he nor his younger siblings recognized. Eleanor read it in the quiet of her study, and something in her expression, when she finished, made Julian set aside his own papers and cross the room to her side. "What is it?" "A young woman named Charlotte Meade," Eleanor said slowly, still scanning the letter. "She writes that her family has a boundary dispute with a neighboring estate, one that has dragged on for months without resolution. She heard of our own history through a mutual acquaintance and wondered whether I might offer any counsel." Julian read the letter over her shoulder, his brow furrowing with familiar concern. "It sounds remarkably similar to our own beginning." "It does." Eleanor set the letter down thoughtfully. "Though I suspect very few disputes carry quite so dramatic a resolution as ours did. Still, I remember exactly how it felt to stand at that gate 10 years ago, certain the world had turned against my family, for reasons entirely beyond my control. I do not think I could read a letter like this and simply set it aside." They invited Charlotte Meade to the manor the following week, a quiet, earnest young woman, not much younger than Eleanor had been during those difficult early days. Her story, as she told it over tea in the same drawing room where Julian had once addressed the assembled neighborhood about the covenant, bore only a passing resemblance to Eleanor's own history, but the fear in her voice was entirely familiar, the same helpless frustration of watching a family's fortune hang on documents and disputes beyond her control. "My father is not a well man," Charlotte explained. "He has not the strength to fight this properly, and our neighbor, Lord Ashcombe, seems determined to press his claim regardless of the cost to either family. I do not know where else to turn." Eleanor listened carefully, remembering with startling clarity how it had felt to sit across from someone with power and resources she did not possess, uncertain whether honesty alone would be enough to secure what rightfully belonged to her family. "Tell me everything you know of the dispute's origins," she said gently. "Sometimes the truth of these matters lies buried somewhere unexpected, waiting only for someone patient enough to search for it properly." Over the following weeks, Eleanor and Julian involved themselves in Charlotte's situation with the same determined care they had once applied to their own circumstances, though this time from a position of considerable advantage rather than desperate uncertainty. Julian's standing as a duke carried weight that opened doors closed to the Meade family alone, and Eleanor's own hard-won experience proved invaluable in helping Charlotte organize the scattered records and half-remembered family history that might yet prove her family's claim. It took nearly 2 months of careful investigation, but eventually the truth emerged, not through any hidden covenant this time, but through old surveying records long forgotten in the county archives, records that clearly established the boundary exactly where the Meade family had always claimed it stood. Lord Ashcombe, confronted with evidence considerably more thorough than he had anticipated, and perhaps mindful of the Duke of Harcourt's involvement in the matter, withdrew his claim, with far less resistance than Charlotte had feared. "I do not know how to thank you," Charlotte said. On the afternoon the dispute was finally settled, her relief evident in every line of her posture. "I came here a stranger, and you treated my family's troubles as though they mattered as much as your own once did." "They did matter," Eleanor said simply. "I have not forgotten how it felt to face uncertainty of this kind, without the resources or standing to fight it properly. If our own difficult history can serve any purpose beyond the happiness it eventually brought us, I would rather it serve exactly this, helping others find their way through similar trouble more quickly than we managed on our own." That evening, after Charlotte had departed with her family's fortune secured, Eleanor found herself once again at the old fence, now grown soft with 10 years of wear. watching her children chase each other across the field that had once divided two families and now belonged, unquestionably, to their shared future. Julian joined her there, as he so often did, settling beside her with the easy familiarity of a decade spent together. "You did a good thing today," he said, watching their children's laughter carry across the evening air. "We did a good thing," Eleanor corrected gently. "I could not have helped Charlotte nearly so effectively without everything you brought to the matter. Your standing, your patience, your willingness to see justice done regardless of whose family benefited from it. Perhaps that is simply what this field taught us both in the end," Julian said thoughtfully. "That old wounds, given honest attention rather than continued silence, can become something far more useful than mere painful memory. They can become wisdom, passed forward to whoever needs it next." Eleanor smiled, leaning into him as the sun began its slow descent behind the distant hills, painting the sky in the same warm colors that had marked so many of their evenings together over the past decade. She thought of her mother, whose quiet courage in preserving those hidden letters had ultimately set this entire chain of events into motion, and felt a familiar swell of gratitude that had never quite faded, not once in 10 years of marriage. "Do you think she would be proud?" Eleanor asked softly. "To see how far her old secret has traveled, from a locked trunk in an attic to helping strangers she never knew existed?" "I think," Julian said, in drawing her closer against the evening chill, "that she would be proud simply to see her daughter standing here, happy and unafraid, exactly as she once hoped to be herself, before circumstances took that happiness from her prematurely. Everything else, I suspect, would seem to her like a gift she never expected but always secretly hoped for." They watched their children play until the last light faded entirely from the sky, the old boundary fence standing quiet and unremarkable now, no longer a symbol of division but simply a familiar landmark in a life built, at last, on honesty rather than hidden secrets. And somewhere in the manor library, two portraits continued to look out from their frames upon a family whose story had finally, after so many years, been allowed to end exactly as it always deserved to, not in quiet regret, but in genuine, well-earned happiness that no locked gate or hidden covenant could ever threaten again. Word of Eleanor's help to the Meade family spread quietly through the county in the months that followed, and before long, others began writing as well. Families caught in similar disputes, uncertain marriages threatened by old family secrets, young women fearing that inherited scandal might ruin prospects they had done nothing to deserve. Eleanor found herself, almost without intending it, becoming a quiet resource for exactly the kind of trouble she had once faced entirely alone, and she welcomed each new letter with the same patient care she had shown Charlotte, understanding better than most how heavily such uncertainty could weigh on a family already stretched thin by worry. Julian supported her in this new, unplanned calling wholeheartedly, often joining her in reviewing old records or writing letters on behalf of families whose standing alone could not open the doors that his title so easily unlocked. Together they became known throughout the county not merely as a duke and duchess fortunate in love, but as a couple genuinely invested in seeing fairness done, wherever old disputes threatened to unravel the futures of people who deserved better than inherited misfortune. Their own children grew up hearing these stories alongside the history of their parents' courtship, learning early that kindness and persistence could accomplish what fear and silence never could. Henry, in particular, developed a keen interest in estate law as he grew older, often accompanying his father on visits to tenant families and neighboring estates, absorbing lessons in fairness and patience that would serve him well when the responsibilities of the Harcourt title eventually passed to him. Eleanor's own father lived to see his grandchildren grow into their early years, spending his final seasons surrounded by a happiness he had once feared he would never witness again after the long, difficult years following his wife's death. He often sat with Eleanor in the evenings, recounting small memories of her mother that he had kept private for years, finding at last that sharing those memories brought him comfort rather than the old familiar grief. When he passed peacefully one winter morning, Eleanor buried him beside her mother, the two graves finally reunited after so many years of quiet separation, much as their long-hidden love story had finally been allowed to rejoin the light. Lady Constance, too, grew old within the family she had once guarded so fiercely, her sharp edges softening year by year until she became, in her final seasons, a beloved and doted-upon figure among her great nieces and nephews, who knew nothing of her earlier resistance and loved her simply as the sharp-witted, endlessly generous aunt who always seemed to have exactly the right advice for whatever trouble they brought to her door. She spoke, on occasion, of the difficult early days following her brother's death, though always with a wry, self-aware humor about her own earlier stubbornness, and Eleanor came to understand that beneath the older woman's fierce protectiveness had always lived a genuine, if imperfectly expressed, love for the family she had spent her whole life trying to shield from harm. As the years continued to pass, the field itself remained exactly what it had become on that first difficult morning, when Eleanor stood before a locked gate, uncertain of her family's future. It grew rich crops season after season, provided a gathering place for children's games and quiet evening walks, and stood always as a living reminder that even the deepest hurts, given honest attention and enough patient courage, could eventually be transformed into something lasting and good. Eleanor often told her own daughter, as she grew old enough to understand the full weight of her grandmother's story, that love delayed was never love lost, only love waiting patiently for its proper season to finally, fully bloom.